Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have writer and author Osita Nwanevu with us today. We'll chat with him in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Osita Nwanevu is a contributing editor at The New Republic, a columnist at The Guardian, and the Democratic Institution Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. He is a former staff writer at The New Republic, The New Yorker, and Slate, and his work has also appeared in The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, The Nation, Harper's Magazine, the Columbia Journalism Review, In These Times, Flaming Hydra, and Gawker. Osita, welcome into the back room.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's talk about your book. It's called The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. Tell us about the central theme.
So this is a book about democracy. I've been covering politics for about 9-10 years now. And it occurred to me a couple of years ago that democracy was really at the heart of a lot of things that are going on in politics. Obviously, Donald Trump wins in 2016 with an electoral college victory rather than a popular vote victory. I remember in 2000, when I was in second grade, that happening with George W. Bush and not really understanding why people were so angry, but feeling vicariously angry as well. And so, that conjured up for me when it happened in 2016, this fundamental question: do we have a fair way of electing presidents? Obviously, since then, we've had many occasions to think about democracy, whether it's him trying to overturn the 2020 election or January 6th. But, also, I covered the Democratic primary in 2020. And I find myself having to say over and over and over again, if Democrats win, even if they win the presidency, even if they win Congress, probably not going to do what they want to do on healthcare or immigration or gun control, unless they're kind of structural reforms of the way the federal system works. And I found myself describing that without really explaining it or sort of thinking through, okay, why is that the case? Do we have a democratic system if these things are so hard to do? What is democracy? When Republicans say, actually, we're a republic and not a democracy, are they right? How do we work through some of that? And so I took the opportunity to write a book where I try to get the heart of what democracy even is. And it's a book that I think takes us through a lot of the features of our political system and our economic system and makes the case that we're not really a democracy, that we could become one if we make certain major changes.
And you're right about what people say about what our political system is. So what is it? Let's settle this debate once and for all.
Right.
Most people walk around going, up until recently perhaps, I feel like I could say whatever I want, wherever I want, as long as I don't scream fire in a movie theater. Right. I can go where I want, I can assemble, whatever. I'm living in a free country.
Now,
I'm living in a democracy.
Sure.
But it's not really a democracy, is it?
No. And I think that you can only get to that conclusion if you take a step back and think about, okay, what is democracy actually? The most succinct definition I could give is that democracy is a system in which the governed govern. Governance isn't given over to some king, some class of elites, some aristocrats. The people themselves who are governed by the system are the ones doing the governing. Or in Lincoln's formulation, government of, by, and for the people. And I've come to basically three different components that I think describe a democratic system. The first one is equality. So people who come to make a collective choice democratically are in equal standing with each other. There's no one class of people that counts more, matters more than another. The second thing is responsiveness. Democracy is not a suggestion box. When people come together to make a choice, things happen. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is majority rule. So when we come together to make decisions, from all the ways we could make that choice together, from some form of unanimity, unanimous agreement, all the way down through some form of minority rule. Majority rule is the only one that's consistent with the principle of equality. If two people want something and three people want some other thing, it's very hard for the two to get their way over the three unless there's some kind of fundamental inequality involved. So majority rule, for that reason, is very, very important. And, you describe these things to people and they sound pretty commonsensical, pretty straightforward. But our political system flouts them in very, very basic ways. So I've done a number of events for this book in Washington, D.C., for instance. And I always make a point of saying, look, Washington, D.C. is a city of about 700,000 people without full representation in Congress. They have a single non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who can't actually vote for the final passage of legislation. Right? So they are being governed by the federal government without an equal or full say in federal governance. And there are actually 4 million Americans for whom this is true, most of whom live in Puerto Rico. There's no definition of democracy in which those people are living in democracy today. It's just flat out
Right.
basic first principles. They're not living in one. But even those of us who do have full political rights, we elect senators and representatives, our representation is actually distributed very, very unequally. So California, state of about 40 million people. If it were its own country, it would be one of the 40 largest countries in the world. It is one of the largest economies in the world. Has the same number of senators as Wyoming. A state of fewer than 600,000 people, fewer than DC, as a matter of fact. They both get 2 senators, right? Functionally, this means that in that chamber, a resident of Wyoming has about 67 times the representation of a representative of California. We're told in school, if people remember school, that this is balanced out by the House of Representatives. The House is the population apportioned chamber, right? That's not really true. The Senate alone shapes the judiciary. The Senate alone shapes the executive branch. So that inequity shapes the Supreme Court. It shapes the executive agencies, right? And obviously you need both houses to pass legislation, ordinary legislation. And so the smaller states, rural states, exercise a kind of veto power within the system on that basis. So the book goes into a lot of different things of that nature. I think that if you take a step back, think about what democracy fundamentally means, you're drawing to the conclusion that we're not really one. And obviously, over the course of our history, we've done a lot of things to expand democratic rights. We've granted the vote to women and minorities. We now have the direct election of senators, which we didn't have originally, et cetera. But from my perspective, I think the conservatives, and this is kind of heretical for liberals to say, I think conservatives are more right than they are wrong about the nature of what the system is. We are a Republican government. All that really means is there are checks and balances, there are different, branches of government, there's rule of law, there's, distributed power in some sense. But republics aren't intrinsically democratic. Rome, famous republic in ancient history, it was not a representative democracy in the sense that we'd understand it today. So we are clearly a republic of some kind. And I think the book makes the argument that if we make certain fundamental changes that I think we're democratically entitled to, we can become a democratic republic. And that should be a goal that we set for ourselves.
And what are some of those constitutional changes, especially the ones you believe are most urgent, if America is to function as a true democracy?
Well, I think the Senate is the most troubling thing and also the hardest thing to change. Now, for the territories that don't have full representation, it'd be very easy if they agreed to it, the residents of Puerto Rico and DC and the other territories, to grant them statehood. That would kind of even out this partisan imbalance that's arisen. It would get them full representation on a democratic basis. But a more fundamental change to the way Congress is designed isn't something you can really do without constitutional overhaul. And the book isn't arguing for that, in the next year or 5 years or 10 years, but it's an argument that we should move towards a kind of refounding and a new constitutional document, order, or whatever, over the course of many decades. I see this as a kind of movement akin to the women's movement, the civil rights movement. But the Senate is I think, the statehood push and admitting territories of states, one kind of temporary fix. Longer-term fixes, I think, would be harder. But it is one of the most fundamental, I think, important places where you see these kinds of inequities and you see why they matter. Other things like the Electoral College, I think, are actually a lot simpler. So constitutional amendments, this is a process that in and of itself probably needs to be changed. It's very, very hard to amend our Constitution. It's the hardest Constitution to amend in the world. So if we wanted to do something about the Electoral College, you could go that route, probably wouldn't succeed, but you could also participate in what's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So the way this works is states are actually allowed to decide how they give over their electoral votes. And if a number of states totaling the 270 you need to win an election says, we're actually going to give our electoral vote to the people who win the popular vote, you've basically done this end run around the Electoral College as it's currently designed. And actually, many states have done this over the last 20 years, where it's 200-something votes committed to this project. So once we hit 270, this would be a way of leapfrogging over the Electoral College. You don't really hear about it in politics, despite how consequential it would be. But this is, I think, the most likely way we get to a popular vote for the election of the president. One of those things I'd mention, because it's in the news now, we're talking about gerrymandering. People are, going back and forth about whether Democrats should do this tit for tat with Republicans on redistricting. But I think the bigger issue is we have a system in the House of representation. Doesn't really make sense. It incentivizes gerrymandering, incentivizes politicians choosing their own voters. What we could do instead is move to a system of proportional representation. Right now, the way Congress works, the way the most districts in this country work, below Congress even, is you elect one person per district, right? You go to the polls, one guy who wins more votes than everybody else gets the position. Even if, they may win 40-something%, and most people actually vote for other candidates. The person who wins the highest total wins. That's what first past the post means. This creates a huge incentive to draw the districts in such a way that you're boxing the other parties out because, well, only one guy's going to win, and so you'd better do what you can to ensure that he's the person, your party is advantaged in that district. But we could move to a system of multi-member districts and proportional representation where in each district, you're sending multiple people to Congress. So, if you win 40% of the vote as a Democrat, Democrats win 40% of the seats in the district. Republicans might win 30% of the seats in the district. If they get 30% of the vote, a third party might win 10%. That's a system in which it's very, very difficult to box out the parties just from getting anything, so there's less incentive to gerrymander. It's a system where you're electing all kinds of people in all kinds of districts around the country. It's not just, a Republican district or a Democratic district. You have this kind of blend of representatives from different parts of the country. And it's also a system where you allow for the possibility of third parties to emerge. So that's another change I think would really, really dramatically transform our federal system as we know it. There's a bill called the Federal Representation Act, pushed by Don Bayer, that would get this done. So a lot of different ideas like that in the book, and I encourage people to check it out.
And how would we go about changing the imbalance of power in the Senate?
Well, I think the Senate, again, it's a place where you see these inequities really, really mattering a lot, and they're mattering in such a way that advantages the Republican Party. The smaller rural states tend to be more conservative, and so Republicans have a kind of intrinsic advantage in that chamber. The last time Republicans, I believe, controlled seats representing a majority of the American population in the Senate was 1996. And despite that, they've controlled that chamber for more than a decade. So right away, you see that there are very serious partisan implications for the way the Senate is designed. So this is why I think that we should probably add a number of territories, Puerto Rico, DC, Virgin Islands, etc., that seem to be a little bit left-leaning in their skew. Mm-hmm. And that would create this kind of more partisan balance and more equitable representation in the chamber as a kind of substitute for the harder thing, which is going to take a very, very long time, which is how do we redesign this chamber entirely and move to a different system of Congress, decades and decades from now. That's a long-term project. I think there are a lot of different ideas about how we could do that, what we could do there. But the most immediate thing, I think, would be to admit new states. And that's actually something that doesn't take very much to do. You can admit a state with simple majorities of Congress. It's not something you need a huge, weird constitutional amendment or anything to do. You just, if you control Congress, you control the presidency, you can sign up new states into the Union.
And what about the Supreme Court? It has these lifetime appointments. Right. I mean, if we talk about the imbalance of power, it is heavily right in its politics and making decisions based on politics. What can we do there? What should we do there? There's been a lot of talk of expanding the court.
Right.
Like Joe Biden could have tried to do that.
Right. Well, he could have. And I think that's the easiest way of, in a manner very similar to what I just described with the Senate, reorienting the partisan balance in the kind of near term to account for the fact that Republicans have basically forced their majority on the bench there. But, the other thing we could do is institute term limits for Supreme Court justices in general. So it's not this kind of high stakes battle every time somebody dies. The person you put on there is going to be there for like 40 years. And so it really, really matters. And you have to do everything you can to put the person on the bench. We're the only system, I think virtually the only system in the world that has long lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court. It creates all these kind of perverse incentives. I think it's strange and bizarre that anytime somebody takes a fall, who's serving on the Supreme Court, you have to watch the news to figure out whether you're going to have abortion rights, whether you're going to have this or that. It's an insane system. And so term limits would be one immediate thing we could do. And there are all kinds of reforms that people have proposed too. So maybe instead of appointing people in the way that we do right now, you have the Supreme Court as a kind of neutral bench that's just a bunch of lower judges. They're circulated up every so often to serve on the bench and they're circulated out. It becomes more of a kind of neutral civil service body instead of this kind of high stakes political arena that it is now. So there are ideas there. And again, I think that, these are things you could do with Congress if you just had the motivation, the will, the understanding that a big reform there is important and worth doing.
And recently we've witnessed a major assault on free speech over the Jimmy Kimmel situation. Free speech has suddenly become incredibly vulnerable and weakened. How might a new founding strengthen and further protect what we've previously thought of as inalienable rights?
Well, the free speech question is really interesting. I have a lot of critiques of the Constitution in this book. I think the Bill of Rights is pretty spot on, with the exception of the Second Amendment, of course. We can get into that. But the First Amendment, I think, is a really, really fundamental and foundational part of our governing order in this country. And the attacks we're seeing on it under this administration are obviously horrifying. The part of the book that I think speaks most to this is actually the last part of the book, where I'm talking about the economy. I think the New York Times reported today that they've seen more than 100 people being fired because they'd said something about Charlie Kirk, and there was this kind of witch hunt against them that conservatives ginned up. And one of the reasons why that's so effective is that in this country, we have a system of at-will employment. Basically, you can be hired or fired on the basis of whatever your employer wants to hire you or fire you for, which is actually very, very unusual. Most countries in the world have systems of cause employment. If you want to get rid of somebody, you have to demonstrate that it's important in some way to the business. It can't just be an arbitrary reason, like they said something about Charlie Kirk you don't like, right?
Well, I should point out, though, in this country, the status of an employee, like if they're an hourly worker or if they're not a salaried higher level employee, then at will does apply. But if you're talking about some like a vice president of a company, you still need cause and a paper trail and documentation that could take, months before you make the case that when you do, and then you could still be sued anyway, and you'll probably settle because, so it is a broken system regardless.
It is. And, most people are kind of beholden, who are not vice presidents, who are not executives. Those people do, exist in this system of at-will employment. And I think one of the reasons why this is so important beyond this kind of free speech issue is part of this book is about how we're governed in more places than just politics. We spend about a third of our lives at work. Decisions that are made at work often affect us more directly and intimately and immediately than decisions that are made in Washington, D.C., or in our state houses or in our city halls. And yet we tell ourselves we're not entitled to any kind of voice or agency at work in those kinds of spaces, which is strange. It is strange, for instance, that somebody who works at Amazon, let's say, can go to the polls. I think they should have the right to go to the polls and have their voice heard on what our foreign policy should be with respect to Russia or China or Iran. But there's nowhere in their life where they can say, here's how I think Amazon should work. Here's how I think Amazon should be run. And that matters because I think that work, especially now in America, has become functionally authoritarian in many ways. And the Charlie Kirk situation is an example of this. The idea that for your own private protected speech you make on your own time, in your own way, can become reason for you to sort of lose your job in this kind of way without any kind of recourse, should be troubling to us. So part of the book explores the ways in which work as we know it could be democratized in ways that I think benefit our politics and benefit, our material well-being within the economy. And I think the Charlie Kirk situation only underscores, in this free speech situation, only underscores the extent to which outside of politics, outside of Washington, D.C., we're actually subject to all kinds of authority that we should take a look at democratizing.
And how would we change the amendment process itself, given how difficult it is to update the Constitution under current rules?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. One of the things I always point out to people about the original founding was that there was a process to amend the Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution that the founders just ignored. You needed unanimous agreement from all of the states to amend the Articles of Confederation. When they get to Philadelphia in 1787, they understand right away that this isn't going to happen. Rhode Island didn't even send a delegate to the convention because they didn't like what was going to be going on there. And they said, well, we'll just write into the document we're drafting here that it only takes 9 states to ratify the Constitution. And that's what happened. So, I think that should tell us something. I mean, I don't in this book sketch out step by step. Here is the ladder towards, the roadmap towards doing all the things I talk about in a very kind of specific way. I advance a lot of ideas, and I encourage people to look at them and think about them with the understanding that there could be a time, there could be a moment, there could be reason for us at some point to move beyond the existing constitutional amendment system, and craft a new document by other means. The founders did that to generate this constitution. I think that we have the prerogative to do it the same way. It's just a matter of building the public consensus around the changes that need to happen. And we're not there yet. This is, again, a process that I think would take many, many decades. I think that there are people who hope, and I've talked to people who hope for a constitutional convention within the next year, 5 years, 10 years. I don't think we've had enough of a conversation as a country about these problems. And I think it's going to take some time. But at a certain point, I hope that people understand that they have the right, just as the founders did, to say, look, Constitution might say this about the amendment process, but we have suffered under this structure, these institutions for so long. They're really, really not working for us. We have a 60, 70%, 80% public consensus about changing certain things. Let's just do it. Let's just convene a convention or conventions and put together a new document.
That all sounds great, and I'm for it. I want to ask you, we're not living in an era of bipartisanship when fairness. Right. I mean, that shit went out the window a long time ago. In fact, our politics today is so toxic, so tribal in its partisanship. Right. Do you really envision a point where the parties can get together and convince the electorate that these are things we need to do?
Not for a long time. I mean, I don't think we're in a place now where we have a Republican Party that respects democracy, that believes in democracy. I think that's a fundamental problem. And, some of the changes that I talk about us doing in the near term, whether it's adding new states or adding justices to the Supreme Court, as we discussed, those are going to be partisan changes. I cannot see a Republican Party getting on board with any of those things. And that's just the reality. I don't think we should shy away from them for that reason. We have a kind of fundamental division here. There's a party that believes in democracy and a party that doesn't. And if you believe in democracy, you should be invested in one of those parties winning.
That creates the concern that if the party that doesn't believe in democracy actually controls all the power,
yes,
that's talking about roadmaps. That's not a pretty picture.
Well, that's the situation we're in. And so the other thing I'd say to you is this. I think so much of the radicalism and extremism you see within the Republican Party is a product of the federal system the way it's designed. As I discussed earlier, Republicans have not controlled a number of seats representing a majority of the American population in the Senate since 1996. They've controlled the chamber for more than a decade. Despite that, obviously in the last 25 years, they controlled the presidency, won the presidency twice without winning the popular vote. If that's your reality, and you can win elections and you can win power in Washington without actually representing most Americans, that means you're going to appeal more and more to the people who actually matter for you, Republican primary voters, conservative voters. And that's, I think, some of the reason why we're seeing a Republican Party that's so out of skew with what most Americans want and believe. And so if you were to enact some of these reforms, let's say the popular vote, for instance, and Republicans really did have to appeal to Americans all across the country in order to win, that would, I think, change the character, or at least I'd hope it change the character of the party a little bit and de-radicalize it a little bit, force it to moderate. Same thing with adding states to the Senate.
How much do you think our current crisis can you attribute to flaws in the Constitution versus the political culture that's developed around it?
I think that they intersect. I think that the Constitution gives politicians incentives to behave badly. Politicians are not angels and will never be angels. I think we might hope that they'd act in the best interests of the country and put their own careers and their personal advancement aside. But politicians don't do this. What they do is respond to structures. They try to win elections. And again, if you can win power without appealing to the broad American electorate, and you're only appealing to people who watch Fox News, and that's how you get into Washington, that's how you win the presidency, that's going to change the character of governance. And so, the Republican Party, I really wish and I'd hope that they'd see the light someday and have this kind of kumbaya moment that people have been wanting them to have. I just don't see it happening. And so there has to be a point at which we reform the system in such a way that they are forced to moderate. And they're forced to moderate because they have to win over most Americans, not just their segments of the country, plus a few swing voters here and there.
You know, you talked about gerrymandering, and we've been hearing a lot of this in the last few months. And when you hear it from the left, it's always about we, the Democrats, are getting screwed. That's the narrative. Yeah. But what's really happening, if you get more granular, is that it's disproportionately disenfranchising voters of color. And so how do you see the role of race and inequality and historical exclusions in shaping your argument for a new founding?
Well, I think many people have said and written lots about the ways in which slavery influences the design of our political institutions at the convention. So there's a little bit of discussion about that in the book. But, also, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing a right that is so hostile to democracy now is because they fear demographic change, right? They fear majoritarianism because the majorities that's emerging in America today is going to be more and more diverse as the years go on. And so that's intensified their hostility to their angst about democracy. I think we have to be straightforward about saying that, about explaining to people this is why Republicans are making things about voter ID. This is why they're trying to throw people off the ballot rolls. But I think it's an important part of the story. And, it's hardest to vote always for people who are at the margins of society, who are poor, who are excluded in some kinds of ways. So if we have a voting system that's out of whack internationally, that makes it harder to vote than other countries do, people who are going to feel the brunt of that are obviously going to be minorities and the poor. Most countries in the world have automatic or mandatory voter registration. We don't have that. We kind of throw it over the states to do whatever they want. If we change that and made it easier for people to vote, I think that you would see more participation among those Americans who Republicans are so eager to exclude from the ballot box, exclude from the polls.
You alluded before to the Second Amendment. And from the right, the argument over owning guns is, it says it right there in the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But no one back then envisioned AK-47s. And so I want to ask you, in your view, should the Constitution explicitly guarantee rights to health care, housing, or education, things that also could not be and were not contemplated in the 18th century?
That's a fascinating question. And at the state level, actually, constitutions do include provisions that are about education and the environment and labor. So if we were to have a new constitution someday, we could explore having explicit provisions that would grant people certain rights. I'd be especially interested in labor rights maybe being protected by that kind of provision within a new document. So it's something we could do. But also it creates this kind of political challenge. It's the more things you sort of pile on to a document, the harder it is to get ready to agree on everything. So,
and if I can rephrase that for you, the more things you want to do right for the American people, the harder the right wing is going to fight against it.
Yes.
That's the reality, unfortunately.
That's the reality. So, I don't see any reason why we couldn't include a right to education, for instance, or a right to health care in a new constitution. It's just a matter of whether it's going to be politically feasible when we get to that point.
Right.
Something to explore.
We see Trump making renewed threats against mail-in voting and other parts of the election process. Folks are very concerned that we may not have a free and fair midterm election next year. To avoid this type of threat and threats in the future, would you change the balance of power between the federal government and the states, particularly on voting rights and election administration?
Well, I think that the For the People Act we saw early in the Biden administration had certain federal provisions that would have equalized elections at that level, and it would have forced states to do certain things that I think made sense. I don't know that we should have a patchwork of 50 different ways you can get the right to vote in this country. I think it should be a single kind of provision or a single set of rules. So in that sense, I think that the federal government should have the kind of primacy, especially obviously when it comes to federal elections, but also, in establishing voting rights in general. I don't think I trust the states, Republican states in particular, to maintain accessible polls and accessible vote. The other thing I'd say too is, state politics in ways I don't think we appreciate can actually be even more inequitable and more inaccessible than federal politics. Everybody knows to go to the polls every 4 years to vote for president. People follow the Senate elections. They follow the congressional elections. People don't tune into state and local politics quite in the same way. And people have studied this and said, actually, for that reason, for a few other reasons, the people who participate in state and local politics, people who donate, tend to be whiter, tend to be wealthier. And so for that, so that's another reason why I think I would hesitate to put too many things in the hands of state governments and state legislators. But that also gives us a reason to reform the state's political systems too. In fact, one of the things I think we could do is, as we are moving towards a set of federal changes, we try some experiments at the state level, changing maybe state legislatures, equalizing the vote, making it easier to vote certain ways in different states. And we learn from those experiences and we help have those inform the process of federal reform moving forward. So I think there's a lot to be done at the state level. Obviously, as I said before, you can amend state constitutions. They're easier to amend than the federal constitution. So if we wanted to try out, let's say, a right to education that isn't already in statute, we could try that out at the state level and see how it works. And that's something we could learn from.
Yeah, it's so interesting because lately the spotlight is on states and states' rights so much more as our Constitution and our overall rights are being assaulted by the Trump administration. And we see various governors trying to do certain things. But, back to the Second Amendment for a second, people forget that the reason why we're allowed to have arms, it was to protect ourselves from the government. Yeah. And now we're living in this political environment where the government is sending troops into the states, and we're all supposed to be okay with that. And the states have no control. The governors have no real control over their own National Guard. And it's that's not very Second Amendment-y, in my opinion.
No. Look, we're in an extraordinary situation in this country. When I started this book in 2021, I was already alarmed by a lot of things that were going on. I was alarmed by the Republican Party. I was alarmed by the defects of our institutions that I've described them.
That's but 2021 is like the Enlightenment period compared to
by comparison,
where we are now.
But exactly. I mean, I then could not have imagined that we'd be in a place where people are being thrown into unmarked vans because they wrote an op-ed, a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. We just had the Comey indictments last night, I guess, using the Justice Department to go after an individual, in this way. It's extraordinary. I mean, conservatives have said for a long time that they are against big government, that they are against government overreach and against government repression. And I think that moments like this sort of give us reason to ask whether any of that was really true. Was it the government you were against, or was it the people who were utilizing government, people who had access to power, that you were really against? Are you opposed to big government, or are you opposed to big government that is elected by a diverse electorate, that's elected by a diversifying country? That's, I think, the reality of the thing. Conservatives, I think, believe more fundamentally than they do in democracy, in hierarchy. They believe in preserving what they see as a natural order of things. And that's always going to come first for the right. It's been true since the 18th century. And I think that the Republicans were actually pretty honest about this. There was Mike Lee for a couple of years ago. He said, democracy is not our objective here. We want liberty and prosperity.
Right.
Charlie Kirk, before he passed, denigrated democracy all the time. And so we're at a point where I think a lot of things are being revealed about the right and its actual priorities, the core of its ideology. And I think one of the things we should learn right off the bat is that this antipathy towards big government was never really true. The government cannot be bigger than it is right now in terms of its reach into our own personal lives. It's, the flouting of the rule of law, taking people off the air because you don't like what they say. This is the biggest government has been, I think, in most of our lifetimes. And it's conservatives that are at the mantle of that.
Well, it reminds me of one of my favorite political clips, comedy clips over the last several years. I think it was Jordan Klepper. He went to a Trump rally, maybe the first time around. And everybody was carrying signs like, we're angry, we're pissed off, blah, 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 big government. And he's like, what are you guys angry about? And this couple, they were maybe like 65 years old, or what are you so angry about? And they're like, big government. And he goes, oh, okay. So, you know that Social Security and Medicare is like 55% of the annual budget, so we should get rid of that. And they're like, oh no, we love that. It's like, and that in a nutshell just described everything you just said, and where much of the electorate is at. It's like, big government, okay, if it's for shit I like. Otherwise, I want small government, or autocratic overreach is okay as long as it's not targeted to me and I benefit from it. Like, that's certainly not what the founding fathers intended for us.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just, whatever the founding fathers intended, whatever people believe about the founding and its nature and what went on there, I think it's clear now that we're in an untenable situation. We have political institutions that, rather than protecting us, are exacerbating our political crisis. The very provisions that the founders might have hoped to prevent a demagogue like Donald Trump from getting to power are actually the ones that put him in there. The Electoral College, it was very, very hard to impeach him or remove him from office because there was such a high threshold for doing so. So at a point where I think Americans have to really, set aside civics class and set aside, all of the kinds of romanticized whatever people are encouraged to believe about the founding order, and ask really, really tough questions. And ask themselves what kind of society they want to live in. I believe in democracy for all the reasons I talk about in the book. I think that we are entitled to a measure of control over the conditions that shape our lives. We're not here to live under the thumb of people who are wealthier and powerful than us. And if you believe that, and you believe that America can be a country that embodies that agency and that true freedom, I think it's time to move on from the existing political system, the existing political order, make some reforms, and pull ourselves out of this crisis.
The founders are revered on some great level in American culture. Do you think their legacy, though, has done more harm than good for the democracy we have today, especially when you consider that they clearly never truly prepared for someone like Trump? I mean, you say in the book, and you said it here today, that structurally, the system has helped Donald Trump.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the founders were working with a very limited set of information. They're creating a new kind of government. We've had 238 years of experience with this document that they did not have. They didn't know how it was going to work. We've seen governments all around the world develop their own systems we can learn from and draw from. Political science was not really a discipline in 1787. It is now. People study questions of governance with a level of rigor that they did not. And so there are certain things that we know now and we can perceive now that they couldn't have. They just couldn't have, as intelligent as they were. And I think that should give us the right to say, look, we had a founding generation, from my perspective, deeply, deeply flawed, but they were smart people. They did what they could in the 18th century. We are now in 2025. We have as much of a right as they did to say, what we have right now isn't working, and we should move to a better system. These are people who broke from an empire, created a system of government. Within less than a decade, decided that system was not really great. Created the Constitution we have now. It's very strange to take from that an attitude that we should be reverential towards institutions. The founders themselves were not reverential in this way. Jefferson was not at the convention, famously, but I consider him obviously a founder. Said himself that he didn't think a constitution could last justly more than 19 years. That beyond 19 years, that would be the hand of one generation constraining, extending itself over another. And that there should be regular periods where we reevaluate things. I think 19 is a little too short, personally, but somewhere between 19 and 238. I think we should have come to a point where we ask ourselves fundamental questions about whether the system is working for us and move in a different direction. And that's the point I think we're at now. I think that we should see ourselves as founders. Founding doesn't have to be something that happens once. In fact, I think that after the Civil War, we had a kind of reworking of our political order that allowed African Americans in, that fundamentally remade this country. And I think we're at a point where we have to consider doing that again. And if we don't, I think that the people who are going to remake the country in a fundamentally different way, in a negative way, are on the right. And we're seeing them, in their own sense, refiling this country to their own ends today.
At the heart of your book is faith in democracy itself. What gives you hope, though, that Americans can reimagine and rebuild a system that truly lives up to its ideals?
Well, I mean, I think the American people, I do think this is a special country. I think that people on the left are often, shoehorned into not believing that there's something special about America, something good about America. And look, I think that this country's had a very, very dark and painful and bleak history. But we have a kind of sense of mission about us and a sense of purpose that encourages us to ask these questions every so often. And I think, Americans might not understand exactly why the system isn't working. They're not talking about all the things I'm talking about in the book, but there is a sense that things are not working, that this is not the way politics should be, that we're not solving our problems the way that we ought to. And I think that can be the seed for something really, really grand and profound. If we have leaders that are encouraged to tell the American people, yeah, you're right to say things aren't working, and here's how we could do things better. Here is the vision of American society that we should be working towards and moving to. But it takes leadership and it takes creativity, it takes political imagination. I don't know that we see a lot of that from the people in charge now. But the American people are capable of a lot. We are capable of so much as a country. And I don't see what happened in November as a sign that we should be, taken in by despair. Things have been so much worse, and we've made so much worse mistakes. And despite that, and despite all the other things we have going against us, we've found the capacity to create a better society and a better country, even in our darkest moments. And I think that's still possible. I think that's still well within the realm of possibility.
All righty. Osita, thanks so much for coming on. Great conversation, and continued good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
All righty. Take care.
Bye.
This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Matty Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.